Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and this is another Liberate Raleigh video. Today I'm going to be discussing a couple things that were brought up by a streamer that's fairly popular, a libertarian socialist streamer called Vaush, wherein he talks about this thing called his Coconut Island scenario. And also I'm going to be talking about a short little video I saw of him where he was discussing anarcho-capitalists and saying that they were all fascists. So I wanted to address both of those things, given that I guess maybe I should introduce myself a little bit, since I might be pulling people from Vaush's audience, so they have no idea who I am. I'm going to be approaching this from an anarcho-capitalist perspective when I address these things. I myself identify as an anarcho-capitalist. I generally call myself a Rothbardian center anarcho-capitalist. On the Sapley test, which I recently took, I am all the way at the bottom of the libertarian axis, and about between the center line and the right, I'm about equidistant from both of them. And I also place extremely progressive on the progressive conservative scale. So the reason why I'm doing this is I actually listen to Vaush a lot. I frequently play his videos on YouTube when I'm at work and listen to his interviews, his debates, and his commentary on other people's videos. And I think that a lot of his criticism is born out of lack of knowledge about anarcho-capitalism, particularly anarcho-capitalist theory, and is heavily influenced by the online anarcho-capitalist community. So I think that somewhat a lot of the things he says are forgivable. And I'm going to try to approach this video as sort of like extending the olive branch to him and sort of explain why it doesn't really need to view anarcho-capitalists as enemies. This is not the first time I've done a video like this. I have a bottom unity video. If you're not familiar with bottom unity, that's the concept that libertarians, whether they be left or right libertarians, should be unified in their opposition to the government and oppression. I'm a big proponent of that, and I think that a lot of the conflict arises from semantic arguments, as far as like different uses, different definitions for different words. And my video explicitly is titled "The False Conflict Between Capitalism and Socialism." So I really want to view this video as just sort of like explaining, using criticism of Vaush's examples as an opportunity to explain consistent anarcho-capitalist theory and principles, so that Vaush and other people on the left can sort of see that like a consistent anarcho-capitalist, particularly somebody who espouses Rothbardian private property principles, isn't an enemy of left libertarians. We're actually saying a lot of the same things. We just might be using different language. So I'm going to link that bottom unity video. I'm also going to link my playlist called Foundations of Anarchism, which goes through basic definitions of terms that I use and would be common to most anarcho-capitalists. So maybe that would be informative. So go watch those. Hopefully you'll get something out of them. So I want to start with talking about Vaush's Coconut Island scenario. So the other thing I was going to mention was, what I was going to talk about was his video on anarcho-capitalists being fascists. I'm going to link to that video. I'm not linking to anything regarding Coconut Island. It's a very simple scenario. You can, everybody knows what it is. I'll explain it to you here. It's the concept that it's the scenario where two people get shipwrecked. They end up on this island. They're unconscious. One of them wakes up, gathers up all the coconuts on the island, so they've got all the food for themselves. The other person wakes up, and the first person who has all of the coconuts says, hey, I'll give you coconuts. I'll exchange them with you if you give me sexual favors. Mic drop? Well, not really. The thing here is this is a clearly contrived scenario, and it really doesn't prove anything. So the way to show this is, or one way to show this is, you can pretty much come up with scenarios that prove anything like this. So I can alter the scenario such that somebody gathering up all the coconuts produces a positive outcome, or at least is a much better outcome than people sharing. So how would you do this? Let's say you just have to tweak it a little bit and put some more conditions into it. So let's say they're stranded on the island and there's only enough coconuts for 19 man days of survival. So 19 man days would be, if there's one person, they'll live 19 days and on day 20 they die. If there's two people, then they both live, one can live 10 days, one can live 9 days, and then on the 11th and 10th day, they die. So Vaush's criticism is to criticize like inequality in wealth. So if we look at this altered scenario, let's say they decide, okay, well, we're in this together, we're gonna cooperate and share equally, which I think Vaush would say is the best thing to do. Honestly, I would agree with that. I think that you should cooperate and share if you're in this sort of scenario, but that's not the point here. The point is to show that you can prove anything you want with these contrived scenarios. So you've got 19 man days of survival. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that on day 11, a rescue ship will come and rescue these people. So if you share equally or near equally, let's say one person, they decide that, okay, we're going to share equally, but for whatever reason, person A is going to be able to get 10 man days of survival from the coconuts, and the other person is going to say, you know what, I'm going to take the hit. We're working together. I'm only going to survive 9 days. Well, what happens in this scenario? They both die, because the first person only lives 10 days, and then they die. The second person lives 9 days, and then they die. And then the ship comes, and there's 2 dead bodies. Well, what if the first person had woken up, as in Vaush's scenario, taken all the coconuts, and deprived the other person of any coconuts at all? In that scenario, one person lives, one person dies. So you've got 2 scenarios here. They both die, one dies. Is it obvious which is the more morally correct one in this situation? Not really. So you can't really say, you can't really draw this conclusion that, like, in all scenarios, hey, you should always share, or, this concept of people being able to unequally accumulate wealth, it's a bad thing. So there's also there's some other ways of looking at this. So let's say you don't like that scenario. Let's look at another scenario. Let's say these people are stranded, and one of the people is just, regular person, regular Joe, but the other person has severe impulse control. And the first person knows this, and they know that the second person is simply going to, as soon as they see coconuts, they're just going to eat them. It doesn't matter. They eat them. An hour later, they vomit them back up because they're gorged, but the coconuts are no longer useful. So the first person knows this. So what do? They gather up all the coconuts. And in order to, they also know, as part of this scenario, they know that the only way to moderate the second person's compulsion is to offer the prospect of giving the first person sexual favors in order to lower their impulse control and allow them to, let's say, only eat one coconut a day. And by doing this, they're able to extend out their survival time. So in this scenario, gathering up all the coconuts and exchanging them for sexual favors improves both people's chances of survival. So what do these scenarios really prove? What do they show us? They don't really show us much of anything. You can contrive them to supposedly prove cooperation being bad. Like, did I disprove? Do these scenarios disprove the idea that somebody should be able to accumulate unequal wealth? They really don't, because it all depends on what the circumstances are, and you can contrive them any way you want. Another thing is, you can alter the scenario. You can assume that people are going to cooperate and share equally, which I believe would be Vaush's preferred scenario. There's no unequal wealth. And also have a terrible outcome very similar to the one in the Coconut Island scenario. So let's say these two people are stranded. They wake up and they decide, okay, whatever either of us finds, we're going to cooperate, and any coconuts that either of us find, we're going to cooperate and we're going to share them equally. And so they agree to this. And then what happens? The first person says, okay, well, I'm going to share whatever I find, but I'm also going to refuse to do anything. I'm going to refuse to work. I'm going to refuse to look for coconuts. I'm just going to sit here, and I'm not going to do anything until you give me sexual favors. And if you don't, then we're just going to starve. And let's say, for the sake of this particular scenario, again, from the beginning, we have stepped well into the realm of utterly improbable scenarios. So let's just keep going with it. Let's say not only that, it's going to require both people's cooperation to gather the coconuts in order to survive. So it's not like the second person can just get the coconuts on their own. They need both of them in order to do it. So the first person is holding both of their lives hostage in exchange for sexual favors. Now, you might object here that, well, okay, they're putting themselves at risk. Also, their own life is being put at risk. So it's kind of a little bit different. Well, again, these are contrived scenarios. You can simply contrive it a little bit more. Let's say the first person simply wants all the coconuts for themselves, but they've agreed to, for whatever reason, they've agreed to equally share them. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that as part of this scenario, the second person is weaker and less healthy, and the first person knows it. Maybe the second person got injured during the shipwreck. It doesn't matter what the reason is. But the first person knows that the second person is weaker and less healthy and far less suited to survive in the harsh environment. And they know that without their assistance in gathering coconuts, they're going to die within 1 or 2 days. And then after that, they've got all the coconuts to themselves. So in that scenario, they're not putting their life at risk. They're simply willing to wait out, the short term time period it's going to take for the second person to die off, and then they get all the coconuts. Even though they've agreed to, they've upfront agreed to the idea that, hey, we're going to share everything equally. So this kind of shows you how you can just completely construct these scenarios to prove whatever you want. Now, does this disprove as a concept the idea that people shouldn't cooperate or people shouldn't share things equally under certain circumstances? Of course not. That's absurd. It's just a contrived scenario pretty much empty rhetoric that doesn't prove anything. Similar to the Coconut Island scenario. Doesn't really prove anything. It's just a contrived thing. It says, oh, hey, look, in this scenario, there's a potential for a bad outcome. Okay, that pretty much any scenario you can get that. Well, let's look at another assumption of this scenario. Implicitly, it assumes that there's a static number of coconuts. So we're looking at a contrived scenario wherein there's only a certain number of coconuts available, but that's not the world we live in, and really that's not how we want to order society, based on the idea that, hey, resources are static, goods are static, things are static, wealth is static. That simply isn't true. You want to come up with a social system that promotes the creation, the production and the creation of wealth. So even if we concede in the Coconut Island scenario, hey, okay, in this one, equal sharing, like everybody's equal, like maybe the socialist system. Maybe in that scenario it would be best, but you can't extrapolate from very specific contrived scenarios into a general overall system. So as far as it's the Coconut Island scenario's applicability relative to like everyday life, it's really not that applicable at all as far as like a guiding principle. You can't really say, all right, well, because in this scenario, like this contrived scenario, something bad happened. Therefore, if we have this as a general principle, that system, based on those general principles, are going to produce disproportionately greater negative outcomes. That doesn't follow at all. So you can't use this as an indicator of general outcomes. There's also another thing. The Coconut Island scenario is sort of a specific scenario, a specific concrete snenario of a general sleight of hand tactic that is commonly used. It's usually used by leftists and people that are promoting socialism as a criticism of, private property capitalism. And the thing is, this Vaush's Coconut Island scenario isn't some novel thing. Maybe he would admit that himself. I don't know. But there's nothing novel or unique about it. In fact, it's been done tons of times before, and honestly, a lot better. By a guy named G.A. Cohen, wrote an entire book called Why Not Socialism, where he had a very similar scenario. I believe it was, and I'm going off of memory, it's been a while since I was reading into this. I believe it was a camping scenario, and he compared camping under socialism versus camping under capitalism, and of course socialism. The idea is, everybody's having fun, everybody's sharing, and so on and so forth. And under capitalism, everybody's trying to take advantage of everybody. Everybody's trying to get, they're all going for profit, and so on and so forth. So what is the sleight of hand here? Well, this was debunked by somebody named Jason Brennan in his book, which is a reply to Cohen's book called Why Not Capitalism. The sleight of hand is that Cohen's example is one where you assume like a capitalist private property situation scenario, and you insert into it immoral people. And of course, when you put immoral people into a system, you're going to get immoral outcomes, at least to some degree. But then you implicitly compare that situation to a socialist or equal sharing or a cooperative sort of scenario where people are morally virtuous. And this isn't a fair comparison, and it's pretty much rhetorical sleight of hand to do this. And Jason Brennan very astutely pointed this out in his reply. So if you're going to do this, you have to make consistent assumptions on both sides. Another point that I would like to make, and this is one that Brennan makes, and this is, I guess this is kind of the point where I'm going to sort of impart some knowledge about anarcho-capitalist theory to, I guess, Vaush, in the unlikely scenario he even watches this. The thing that must be understood is under a private property capitalist system, all of the leftist institutions and solutions are permissible. For example, worker co-ops, mutual aid societies, various associations, labor unions, all of these things, every single one of them are permissible under a private property capitalist system. This is, I guess some anarcho-capitalists might object to these things on the grounds that they're not a good idea. I disagree. I personally am a big proponent of all of those things. I'm a big fan of mutual aid societies, associations. I have no problem with, at least as a concept, labor unions. Labor unions in the US tend to be pretty awful. All of these things are permissible. And not only that, if you want to look at more of my videos, I covered a book called The Voluntary City, wherein a lot of those things, that book goes into historical examples of private individuals and organizations providing what are generally considered public goods and public services that most people nowadays think can only be provided by the government. Well, all these things were in the past provided privately. And if you read that book, and I have a playlist where I cover that book and talk about it. So if you don't want to read it, you can just watch my playlist. I'll link it in the notes. All of those leftist sort of institutions were used to provide public goods and services. And all of these things are completely permissible under like an anarcho-capitalist system. There's no contradiction there. You can use all these things can be created. So the general takeaway from the Voluntary City was all these things were provided via a mishmash of various profit-seeking entrepreneurs and capitalist firms, mutual aid societies, various associations, and so on and so forth. There was, profit-seeking organizations and also general cooperation, democratically governed. I'm going from memory. I'm pretty sure that they were democratically governed internally, voluntary membership. They provided a lot of all of the services and things like roads, retirement insurance, retirement pensions, health services, and so on and so forth. So even if you think, okay, we need all of these socialist left-leaning institutions, even if you think they're necessary, and personally I do think they're necessary, I think that without the government providing all these things, a lot of them would be provided by these sort of like generally considered left organizations and institutions. So even if you think that, all these things are perfectly permissible under a private property capitalist system. So what do we know about these scenarios? What do they teach us? Pretty much all they do is show us that if you have crummy people that are immoral in any system, they're going to use it, they're going to manipulate the system or ignore it or break the rules or do whatever to gain some sort of advantage over other people in order to get more wealth, to exercise control over people, to act out their desires or something, or whatever it is that they want in life. They're just going to try to game the system and gain power over people. So that's pretty much what these scenarios ultimately come down to. But let's say, for example, Vaush objects to this and says, Jason, this all sounds great, but in say like a socialist system, simply by agreeing to it, people are taking steps to prevent the ability for people to exercise privilege over other people, because the system itself is a remedy for it. And so they've agreed to it, and they're gonna abide by it, and they're gonna allow the system to work. But again, this goes back to the sleight of hand that I mentioned earlier that, for example, Cohen made in his book. In order for this to happen, in order to make this argument, what you have to do is you have to look at, you have to look at the prior conditions of the people involved here. What assumptions are you making about them? You're assuming that they have the awareness to recognize that there would be a problem, a potential problem of people exercising influence, or influential people abusing that influence to take advantage of other people. You would also have to assume that the general population has a certain level of moral virtue in order to have the willingness to actually act act somehow to prevent these things from happening, to prevent people from exercising this influence and control, to like implement systems to mitigate or prevent it from happening. And also the willingness to cooperate to create those institutions that might be necessary to prevent or mitigate these things from happening. So you have to assume this from the outset before anybody even agrees to live in a socialist system or worker co-ops or things of that nature. But if you make those assumptions about people that agree in that system, you have to make those same assumptions that those characteristics exist in people in a anarcho-capitalist system as well. So you have to assume that people under an anarcho-capitalist system also recognize that there is a potential problem of people using influence to take advantage of other people. And keep in mind, it's not just wealth that people can use. Charismatic people can use their charismatic ability to influence other people to their advantage in a manner that oppresses people. People that are exceptionally intelligent, it's the same thing. People with physical abilities greater than other people can leverage that in order to exert undue influence and ultimately oppress other people. So it's not just wealth. There's a whole host of other criteria that can create this problem. So if you accept that people under a socialist system that maybe Vaush would favor are going to have that moral virtue and that willingness to cooperate and the foresight to recognize these problems, then you have to grant those properties to people under an anarcho-capitalist system as well. You can't just say, okay, these people have a different nature over here, and they're more virtuous and they're more willing to cooperate, but these people over here, they have lower moral virtue, they have lesser lesser willingness to cooperate, they don't recognize these problems exist. So once you grant those things to both sides, and as I said earlier, all of the institutions that, like socialist institutions that might prevail under a system that Vaush favors, are all permissible under an anarcho-capitalist system. And I mean, there's other ways to mitigate these things. There's charities, I mean, pretty much everything that you can think of that can be implemented to mitigate the ability of people to exercise undue influence. You can do them in an anarcho-capitalist system. All those things are permissible. The only criteria, and this is a criteria that I'm sure Vaush would agree with, they must be voluntarily agreed to, because as I understand it, he is a libertarian socialist. Pretty sure he would also describe himself as a libertarian anarchist. So I don't think that proviso that people would have to agree voluntarily to whatever organizations or institutions are implemented would have to be voluntarily agreed to. So again, that sort of objection is pretty much just another restatement of the Cohen sleight of hand. But I can also think of another objection that either Vaush or someone like him might have to, say, implementing anarcho-capitalism. They might say, well, okay, I'll agree to everything you've said up until now, and maybe anarcho-capitalism, implementing a private property system as you advocate, maybe that would be okay if we were starting from scratch. But the problem, Jason, is that we're not starting from scratch. The system, the world as it exists around us, has been influenced through oppression and injustice for pretty much all of human history. And because of this, there are certain people that perhaps because the system is the system that we live in is imperfect, especially with a government, a state government that selects for the worst of us and has been used by influential people, including many wealthy people, to exercise privilege over others. This has resulted in wealthy people accumulating wealth far beyond what they should legitimately have acquired. There are people like, say, politicians that have influence over society that maybe they probably shouldn't have. But I think that the main thing would be that the distribution of wealth, or one of the main things would be that the distribution of wealth as it exists currently, it isn't what a just distribution of wealth would be. Even if you accepted like an anarcho-capitalist system, this is not what would prevail. This is not the distribution of wealth that would prevail. So maybe Vaush would object to the system by saying, that's all well and good if we were starting from scratch, but we're not starting from scratch. There's already all of these embedded problems. There's inequality of wealth that is not the result of legitimate exchange or free voluntary exchange or homesteading or anything like that. So on the wealthy end, there's a lot of people, like the wealthy segment of the population, there's a lot of unjustified wealth that is there. And then on the other end, Vaush might also say, Jason, not only do the wealthy have a lot of access to resources that they don't deserve, and through pretty much criminal activity of the government that has granted them privileges and allowed them to accumulate that wealth. On the other end, there's entire populations out there that have been subject to severe oppression. There's I'm going to try to name some of them that I can think of. There is systemic racism. There's, which, I mean, has been terrible for the black community. There's been oppression of the LGBTQ community. There's also immigrants. I'm trying to think of everything off the top of my head. I'm not going to be able to think of them all, but okay, so LGBT community, you know, for many years it was very difficult for them to actually live openly. Some of them were punished, put to death, severe social ostracism, laws against them, a lot of terrible things. And particularly for the trans community, currently there's legislation that is again going to engage in, if not explicitly outright, will de facto end up oppressing them, which is not good. Immigrants are another one. Immigration laws. Immigrants in general tend to be looked down upon and subject of social oppression. And obviously there's immigration laws that restrict their movement, also severely restrict their ability to find work, the type of work that they can get, which affects their ability to accumulate wealth. And obviously women, that's another one. Have not had a great go of it throughout human history. I think it's only in recent decades that women have been able to get credit cards, which is just downright crazy. So Vaush might say, okay, well, again, it would be great if we were starting from scratch, Jason, but we're simply not. We have all of these embedded systems of oppression. We can't just stop the oppression and say, okay, everybody have at it, everything's fine. We need this socialist system to equalize everything out, and that's why I support it. We need to equalize everything and start from scratch. This is like hitting the reset button, so this is why I support it, and I can't support anarcho-capitalism because it doesn't do that. It just allows people to keep these ill-gotten gains and so on and so forth. However, this is not true. And I think this is an area where, and again, I'm kind of, to some degree, I'm going to admit I may be putting words into Vaush's mouth. So if none of this is correct and he wouldn't actually say any of this, mea culpa, my fault. It's on me. But assuming that he would say this or something similar to it, I think that this is an area where I mentioned earlier lack of knowledge about anarcho-capitalist principles and theory comes into play, because this has actually been talked about, and this isn't true that there is no remedy for this, or that anarcho-capitalists or there is no remedy for it within anarcho-capitalist theory. In fact, Murray Rothbard and Karl Hess, there was an exchange between them, or Karl Hess wrote an article and Rothbard replied to it about this exact thing. They were talking about the idea that, you know, there's all these ill-gotten gains. Particularly, I think they were talking about, Rothbard brought up the idea of corporations that have accumulated resources through government graft or government protectionism, or, you know, influencing government privilege for their benefit. And so what do we do in that scenario? Well, the fact of the matter is that property rights under, say, an anarcho-capitalist system, the only property that is protected is legitimately acquired property. So Rothbard pointed out, and Hess also pointed this out, that resources that are illegitimately acquired are up for restitution or homesteading. So for example, so let's say there's a corporation that has been receiving tax money and protection from the government, and let's say most of its wealth has been acquired via illegitimate means. It is perfectly consistent within an anarcho-capitalist property rights social order that those resources that were illegitimately gotten can be confiscated and homesteaded by people who have not been recipients of this privilege or sought out this privilege. So wealthy people, corporations, there's a lot of resources, and again, this would be handled on a case-by-case basis. So I mean, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, I don't know how much of their fortunes could be considered ill-gotten gains. Maybe most of it. I don't know. It could be all of it. It'd be something to look into. But anyway, the bottom line is that as a remedy, those resources can be confiscated and distributed as restitution payments to the victims. That would be everybody else, and or homesteaded. So all of this to think that there is no remedy within the anarcho-capitalist system for the injustices that exist, the social injustices that have been going on, that were enforced by the government, and so on and so forth. It's simply not true. And I think it's also important to point out that, I think that this might be one of the issues with Vaush getting a bad and incorrect reading on what anarcho-capitalism is, because I think that his exposure is almost exclusively to people in the online community, and there is a real problem within the online anarcho-capitalist community where they are mostly social reactionaries, sort of pretending to be libertarians and calling themselves libertarians or anarcho-capitalists. And so they end up arguing against things like, they pretend that racism doesn't exist, or they are anti-trans, transphobic, homophobic. They have racial bigotry. It's very common for them to argue against open borders immigration. So I think it's important to point out to, say, Vaush in particular, or people on the left, that there's no contradiction between holding those progressive social values while at the same time identifying and upholding anarcho-capitalist private property rights. I do it. I mentioned earlier, I test very far on the progressive scale, as far on the Sapley test, and I don't have an issue with things like systemic racism. I think that's, when you look at history, it's kind of hard to deny it. I'm not sure how anybody can deny that. And I see what's going on with the LGBTQ community and all the transphobic stuff that's been going on. There's no contradiction between being identifying as a right libertarian, right anarchist, anarcho-capitalist, and agreeing with those things and saying, look, we can't just leave things the way they are. There needs to be some sort of restitution and homesteading remedy to rectify the injustices that have been built up over time. I agree with that. That's something that would need to be done. And I think that regardless of what system you want, that needs to be done. So I hope that helps give a different light to Vaush and people that think like him as far as like what anarcho-capitalism is and what it can be, and the type of people that can. And I'm not the only one. There's people like John Hudak, Fakertarians, who is also, you know, socially progressive, identifies as an anarcho-capitalist, probably wouldn't disagree with anything I said. I don't want to speak for him, but probably wouldn't disagree with anything I said as far as like there being a need for restitution. And again, Rothbard actually in his article pointed out reparations for slavery. He pointed out that, you know, they freed the slaves, but they received no restitution for being slaves, and that in a just outcome would have been that they were given the land that they worked on. So, you know, it's pretty progressive sounding, progressive social commentary there. Anyway, that's pretty much what I hope that gives a different light on things. Now I'd like to move on to the second thing that I mentioned earlier. That's Vaush's video where he claims anarcho-capitalists are fascists. So there's only a couple things I really want to comment on here. It's not a very long video. It's only like 6 or 7 minutes long. So the two things I want to talk about are, he makes a claim that under anarcho-capitalism, the rich would take over and they would control everything, and they would own the courts and so on and so forth, and just dominate everything. And the second thing is, he spends a lot of time focusing on Ayn Rand and objectivism. And that seems a little bit odd to me, and I'll explain why. But first, I'll talk about this notion, and really he doesn't really justify it. It's more of like a throwaway line, like, well, yeah, of course, you know, the rich will just take over. They'll just run everything. But he doesn't give any justification for it. He just throws the claim out there. My guess would be that his justification would be something along the lines of, well, the rich pretty much influence the government to exercise privilege on their behalf. So obviously, if we got rid of the government, excuse me, they would just take over, and they would just do the same thing, and just continue controlling everything because they have so much wealth, and they would just run everything. That's probably something similar to what he would say, or the reasoning behind it. And I guess on some superficial level, that's kind of appealing, but it doesn't really make much sense. A couple things that I want to say here. And the first, before I explain this a little bit more, this claim doesn't just apply to the rich. This applies to, this is a common objection to anarchism, and it isn't just stated that, say, the rich would do it. It doesn't matter what libertarian anarchist system you implement, this is a potential problem. So even if you implement socialism and you have worker co-ops, there is the threat there just as much that, say, one or a small group of those worker co-ops gets really big and decides, you know what, we're just going to take over. We're going to run everything, and we're going to force people to be under our control, and they're just going to have to deal with it, and that worker co-op becomes a de facto state. This is a problem that applies universally, regardless of the system. And to single out, say, anarcho-capitalism and the rich under an anarcho-capitalist system, and to not acknowledge this fact that regardless of whatever system you have, you're going to have to deal with it, and it's a potential issue, is inconsistent. So, having said that, we have to understand that we're not dealing with, we have to look at this and deal with it for every system in every sort of institution. So the thing to understand is that when the government exists, there's a couple things that it can, well, first of all, the government is or the state is that institution that has a monopoly on final authority over the definition and enforcement of rights. And naturally, because they are a monopolist, and they forcibly exclude competitors from potentially being able to be a final authority on the definition and enforcement of rights, is people can't voluntarily choose to let somebody else have that authority. Because they have that monopoly privilege, they have an incentive to use it to their personal advantage. And obviously influential people, like rich people, but also labor unions, to go back to worker co-ops. Not that labor unions are worker co-ops, but the point being that even the rank and file labor workers are subject to being seduced by the prospect of having the government exercise privilege on their behalf. So the government, when the government exists, these institutions can use it to gain privilege over other people and accumulate wealth and power. So when you institute libertarian anarchy, regardless of what system you have, the government doesn't exist anymore. Now, there's a couple things about the government that allow it to do what it does and kind of get away with it. And the first thing is what's known as the halo effect. And that's the general perception that what the government does is, well, maybe you don't like it, but it's necessary, they've got to do it, they have the perceived legitimate authority to do what they do. And this is true regardless of what they do. Like, you see this even when police kill people, there are people that think, well, you know what, they shouldn't have run, you know, and the government has the authority to enforce its will upon the population. And this halo effect is important because it means that people don't object. They don't, particularly through force, they don't exercise any sort of force to object to anything the government does. They just, at a minimum, they just kind of passively allow it. And then there's a lot of people that flat out promote it and support it. And the other thing is, so this is what allows the government to actually engage in these sort of actions that oppress people. And then the other thing is, the government has the ability to externalize the cost of exercising privilege on its behalf. They don't actually bear the cost of executing those laws that oppress people. That cost gets externalized onto everybody else. And they do this mainly through taxation and inflation. That's the debasement or the reduction in value of the currency, which is ultimately ends up being a transfer of wealth from the people that hold the currency to those who issue the currency, which is the government, and those institutions that get first crack at that money, which is the large financial institutions. They get to use that money before it works its way through the economy, and the currency gets debased and loses value. So when you take away those two things, you realize that a private individual or a private institution, whether it be a corporation, whether it be a worker co-op, whether it be a wealthy individual, will not have the benefit of the halo effect under an anarcho-capitalist, anarcho-socialist, anarcho-whatever system. Because in order for anarchy to be implemented, people have to convinced that people need to be convinced to reject the government, to reject the state, and reject the idea that a single institution that we call the government or the state should have the exclusive authority to the exclusive final authority over the definition and enforcement of people's rights. So once you take that away, private individuals and private institutions can't simply act and expect to not be opposed in those actions. They can't act to oppress people with the expectation that there will be little to no opposition to that. And the other thing is, because of that, they can't tax people and they can't force people to use a particular currency which they can debase and steal money from them that way. Now, rich people are very rich. Institutions like large corporations, they have a lot of resources, but that pales in comparison to the amount of resources it takes to forcibly take over an area. And this is true regardless of the institution you're talking about. It applies to worker co-ops, it applies to firms, it applies to rich people. It is exceptionally costly because, first of all, you have to convince people to, especially if let's say you're a rich person like Jeff Bezos, you're only one person. You would need to use a large portion of your fortune just to convince people to side with you, let alone actually go out and conquer the area. And then you would have to, even if you were successful, you would have to deal with uprisings and long-term resistance. So the cost-benefit analysis in this situation, regardless of whatever person or institution you're talking about, becomes very slanted towards the cost area. Now that doesn't mean it's impossible, but it does mean that it becomes much more improbable. So the ability to exercise authority over people and to use that authority to gain privilege for yourself and to use that privilege to benefit yourself and those people that you favor becomes a losing scenario. It becomes very, very difficult. And this is something that anarchists pretty much of all stripes have been arguing against, as far as it being particularly possible. And ultimately what it comes down to is the argument is, well, you can't get rid of the government because another government might appear. Well, okay, that's not very convincing, at least not to me, but take it for what it's worth. So that's pretty much all I want to say there, because I want to move on to something else, which I mentioned, and that's Vaush's focus on Ayn Rand and objectivism. And this is very strange because, and this is another situation where it becomes apparent Vaush doesn't seem to have much knowledge about anarcho-capitalism and anarcho-capitalist theory and principles and the historical legacy that it has. And the reason I say that is because he goes on and on about Rand and he says anarcho-capitalists, they believe in the great, if I'm remembering correctly, the exceptional human beings and so on and so forth. So they worship the ground they walk on, these are all things that pop up in Ayn Rand's novels, like Atlas Shrugged. There's people like John Galt, Francisco D'Anconia, Hank Rearden. These are held up as ideals to strive for. Great exceptional people. Dagny Taggart, Midas Mulligan, people like that are really exceptional people that are idolized. So this is a theme in Ayn Rand's work. So, he's correct in talking about this with respect to Ayn Rand. The problem is Ayn Rand was not an anarcho-capitalist. Ayn Rand argued against anarcho-capitalism. Now, it would seem to me to be very strange to be using somebody who didn't believe in a certain philosophy or political philosophy, and indeed argued against that political philosophy, and then to go on and on about using them as an example of anarcho-capitalist principles. I mean, there are anarcho-capitalist objectivists, and some of them have been relatively influential. People like Roy Childs and Morris and Linda Tannehill, people like that. And I understand Roy Childs technically recanted his anarcho-capitalism later in life. However, he never wrote anything to dispute his prior anarchist writings. But for a lot of his adult life, maybe even I think most of it, he was an anarcho-capitalist. And he famously wrote his open letter to Ayn Rand, which was, I think he wrote two things to Ayn Rand, and I might be getting them mixed up. But Ayn Rand definitely wrote a criticism and objection to anarcho-capitalism. And I know that Roy Childs, and I think it may have been the open letter to Ayn Rand, it may have been something else that he wrote, wherein he addressed her concerns and rebutted them. It just seems strange to me that Vaush should be going on and on about this, and it really sort of tells me that he's not very familiar with the principles of anarcho-capitalism. I do think that this is somewhat, at least to some degree, it's understandable, because I get the impression that he has his viewpoint of his understanding of anarcho-capitalism comes from engaging in various online communities, and I think he mentions that in the video. And I know through my own personal experience that online anarcho-capitalists and anarcho-capitalist communities tend to be terrible. They tend to be paleo-libertarians, which are socially regressive libertarians. They worship the ground that Hans Hermann Hoppe walks on. I've criticized Hoppe in one of my prior videos. Hoppe infamously has argued for many years against open borders immigration. He's argued for restricted borders immigration. In my immigration playlist, one of my videos is devoted to point-by-point rebuttal to one of his essays. So the online community that he seems to have exposure to, he's probably dealing with a lot of really awful anarcho-capitalists, which I guess to some degree I get it. You know, he's just going by the people he runs into, but that on some level it still doesn't justify not doing the research. You know, if he's infatuated with objectivism and Rand, then read Roy Childs and the Tannehills, if that's what you're focusing on. They were influenced by Rand and objectivism, and they were anarcho-capitalists. Go there. But I mean, but you really want to hit the big ones, the main people that are like some of the big names, and the two that come to mind, obviously, are Murray Rothbard and David Friedman. I mean, those are arguably the two biggest names within the anarcho-capitalist intellectual tradition. And there's other ones, obviously, like Karl Hess, who I mentioned earlier, who's also an excellent person to read. But if you're going to criticize anarcho-capitalism and you really want to understand it, you really should start with Rothbard and Friedman. You don't start with a critic of anarcho-capitalism like Ayn Rand and then pretend that, oh, she's an example of anarcho-capitalism and her ideas are anarcho-capitalist ideas because she argued against it. So I would say that read some Rothbard, read some Friedman, particularly early Rothbard. Rothbard turns paleo near the end of his life, but for the overwhelming majority of his adult life, he wrote a lot of great stuff. So I get it. I understand to some degree, but I think that with a better understanding of principles, like for example, I mentioned, at the beginning, I described myself as a Rothbardian anarcho-capitalist that is socially progressive. And I've said a number of times that all of the institutions that, if you were a left-leaning libertarian or anarchist, all of those institutions that you favor are perfectly permissible under an anarcho-capitalist system. Mutual aid societies, associations, worker co-ops, labor unions, anything of the like. And if you're interested in more of my commentary on why left and right libertarians should be allies, you can go to my bottom unity video, and I talk a little bit more about that. But I think that if Vaush looked more into it and had more conversations with, like John Hudak would be a great person for him to talk to, someone like that who has an online, the Fakertarians online presence. If he was talking to people like that, or similar people like that, I think he would have a better understanding. And like I said, my point here through this whole video is kind of to extend the olive branch and reach out for mutual understanding and cooperation, because like I said, I don't think there's any intrinsic conflict between anarcho-socialism, anarcho-mutualism, anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-capitalism, left and right anarchists, or libertarians. I don't think that there is any intrinsic conflict there. I think that there's some theoretical disputes, but I don't think in a practical sense, as far as like implementing institutions and systems, I really don't believe that there's any reason why we can't all get along and understand each other and accept each other for who we are, because I don't believe that there's anything inherent in. I just don't see that there's any real conflict. I think that it's mostly semantic. So yeah, I've been trying to promote bottom unity. That's kind of the purpose of this video. I've rambled on too much here, so I'm gonna cut it off now, put an end to it. I hope that anybody watching this, if you're somebody that's already familiar with me, I probably didn't say anything that you haven't heard before, or nothing that's surprising. If you're, say, like a Vaushite left libertarian anarchist, I hope that this gives you a better understanding of right libertarians, or potential what right libertarianism can be, what anarcho-capitalism can be. I hope you would consider me an ally. I'm always, looking to collaborate, discuss things, so on and so forth. So I'm just trying to reach out and, promote cooperation among libertarian ranks. So anyway, that's the video. I hope everybody had a great time. I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye.